founder of Novamente, probably one of the world's first commercial AGI companies, as well as in significant part responsible for this conference. And he's going to be talking to us today about the relationship between probabilistic reasoning or probabilistic turn logic as employed in computer science and functions of the biological brain that may support probabilistic reasoning.
So as I emphasized in my opening talk for this conference, I think there's a lot of different approaches that can potentially lead to artificial general intelligence. And the Novamente engine is the one I'm working on now, which seems to me to have the best chance of getting to powerful AGI quickly. But I can't resist my own brain from exploring all sorts of different possibilities in what little spare time the Novamente project leaves me. And my wife, Isabella, as it happens, is doing graduate work in cognitive neuroscience at the University of Maryland, College Park. So I've been kind of immersed in the various neuroscience papers she brings back from school. And can't help but think, well, how does this stuff we're doing in Novamente relate to what happens in the human brain and mammalian brains more generally? And I certainly don't pretend to know the answer to that, but found some time to pursue some speculations, and together with my collaborator Cassio Pennachin, who's the CTO of Novamente, we made some just small simulations to explore some ideas about how some aspects of logical probabilistic reasoning can be made to emerge from neural net type dynamics. And I think this is a direction to AGI I would be interested to explore if I hadn't conceived the Novamente design, because I think there is potential to get logical operations and higher order thinking to emerge out of neural networks. I think in many ways it's a harder path in building a system like Novamente, but it's still an interesting one. So what I'm going to do now is define some ideas Cassio and I have had about how probabilistic inference might emerge from the brain. And this is not to say that I think probabilistic inference is the only important thing in cognition or AI. It's just a specific question. It's a question that seemed interesting to me because logical reasoning seemed like one of the aspects of intelligence and of AI systems that's sort of hardest to connect to what's going on in the brain. You take something like evolutionary learning, spreading activation networks, reinforcement learning, the connection with the brain is a bit better understood and better established. And drawing the connection between logic and the brain is a bit more speculative at this point. And I think at least we've generated some creative ideas in that regard. So that I apologize, I got really sick of PowerPoint, so I just pasted some stuff into my paper here. But we got some pictures anyway. So the starting point of our little speculation here is that the hypothesis that cell assemblies are important. And this, of course, goes back to Hebb in the 40s. It's not a new idea. So we start from the hypothesis that a mental concept is represented either as a set of cell assemblies, meaning a bunch of neurons that are interlinked together and often fire together and have highly reinforced weights of the synapses between them, or else more complexly, a distinct temporal activation pattern associated with a particular set of cell assemblies. So the same set of assemblies could have many concepts corresponding to different temporal patterns. And I don't know, the first one is simpler. I don't know which of the two the brain uses. It could, of course, use something besides those two. But the logic of our argument works, whichever one of those is the case, as we outline in the paper. We then look at the idea of a sort of synaptic bundle. So you got one assembly of neurons over here, another assembly of neurons over here, and you can have a whole bunch of synaptic links going between neurons here and neurons there, neurons here and neurons there. So then each of these guys, each of these synapses, if you take a formal model of it, you can say, well, there's a weight associated with that synapse. And of course, that weight boils down to a bunch of complex biology. There's not really a weight there, but it's a formal model. And we take these abstractions, the weights, and we say, okay, we've got a bundle of these things with weights. We can say, well, what's the composite weight of the bundle of synapses going from this assembly or group of assemblies to this one? And if they're actually temporal activation patterns, the math still works out. It's just what's the weight of these synapses on average when this temporal activation pattern is active and when this pattern is active. then you can define the weight of the bundle kind of implicitly by saying you got the mean activation here, you got the mean activation here a little bit later. How much of the activation here filters through to being activation here over time? That lets you, over time, implicitly and statistically define the weight of this synaptic bundle. Is it excitatory? Is it inhibitory? Is it strong? Is it weak? So you can think about the weights of bundles from cell assemblies to cell assemblies. And what's interesting there, you can try to use that to kind of emergently get conditional probabilities. Like basically the probability that this cell assembly is active, given that cell assembly was active, or the probability that this temporal activation pattern across a cell assembly is observed, given this temporal activation pattern across a cell assembly was observed. And that gives you a conditional probability. So if you buy that this guy denotes something and this guy denotes something, for example, responding to some observed stimulus in the visual field or something, then you can draw a conditional probability there. And on a formal level, it's interesting to connect that with the simple inference diagrams that we draw in uncertain term logic. So if you look in the term logic-based inference system like Novamente's probabilistic logic networks that my colleague Matt DeClay presented on yesterday, or Pei Wang's NARS system, we have systems of inference that look at, say, transitive inference. This guy implies this, S implies M, M implies P, so S implies P. And then you can go around the loop in different ways. In probabilistic term logic, that comes out from combining a transitive inference with Bayes' rule. In Pei's system, it comes out a different way. But what's interesting, just on the face of it, you say, okay, maybe that's an assembly, that's an assembly, that's an assembly. These are synaptic bundles, and does it work out? Does it work out to say, well, if you've got a high weight connection from this assembly to this assembly, a high weight connection from this assembly to this assembly, does the brain learn through a whole bunch of micro-level instances of Hebbian learning on the neuron-to-neuron level? Does it learn, hey, let's make a connection there? And that was the essential idea we had, and basically we coded up some very simple simulations in Ruby just to see if it would work in some special cases. And there seems to be some meaning there. We haven't done a real simulation study trying to compare it to a real part of the brain carrying out a specific action, which is an important project. So the basic idea, if you think in terms of Bayes' rule, activity here implies activity here in terms of the synaptic bundle, then will the brain learn that activity here should lead to activity there by the collective action of Hebbian learning on a bunch of neuron-to-neuron connections? And you certainly don't get exact mathematics, but you get a rough correspondence with what Bayes' rule would say, which is a nice thing. And of course, we're not that good in many contexts at doing exact probabilistic inference either. And similarly, if you have three guys, you can look at going around the cycle in various ways. And this is where an interesting topic came up, which actually was where we spent most of our work in thinking about this project. I'm not going to talk about it too long because I only have a couple minutes left. But in a probabilistic logic engine like PLN or NARS, you have a difficulty with circular reasoning. So if you have A implies B, B implies C, A implies C, you can go around the circle in any different ways. And in a probabilistic logic system, it's often hard to stop there from being a kind of truth-value pollution, where small errors in the inference just compound and everything becomes nonsense because you're just inferring in every direction constantly, over and over again. And there's a mechanism called inference trails in PLN and NARS that lets you deal with that, where basically each link contains a list of the other links that were used to infer it, and you just disallow circularity. You say, if these guys were used to give rise to this, then you don't use this to adjust the truth value of that. And that using inference trails lets you basically have a bunch of little directed acyclic graphs inside a looping network, thus avoiding the need to make a big directed acyclic graph like you have in a Bayes net. But the brain doesn't seem to have any of that. You know, the brain isn't a directed acyclic graph. It's all tangled up. And the brain also has no inference trails. And each synapse does not store a list in some data structure of all the other synapses that led to its synaptic modification. You know, so the question is, what happens? And what was interesting when you play with simple simulations of this stuff is, what happens is kind of attention allocation comes to the rescue. Like you can set up a system like this, and if the neurons actually aren't getting stimulated except when new data is coming into the system, and you just let the whole thing relax non-linearly, then the combination of the fact that most neurons aren't doing something all the time, they're only doing something when they're stimulated, so the system doesn't want to spend its resources going around in circles doing inference constantly, and then the fact that there's thresholds on neurons, so everything isn't always firing and doing something, because there's some limitation, and there's refractory periods in the neurons where after they fire, then they don't do anything for a while. The combination of these things means that when we actually play with the system, we didn't get this horrible descent into circular inference and contradiction. You do get some error that way, but there's so many other errors in this framework that's not even the biggest error, actually. So you can get a rough correspondence in a network like this with the results of simple probabilistic deduction and Bayes rule and these things. And under the regimes that you naturally would operate the system under, you actually don't get the circular inference problem. You do if you flood the system with input constantly through the whole thing, but that's not what happens when you take a neural network and then have it interact with the world. You have data coming in when the system needs to. So the last thing here, which I'll go over very quickly, is another speculation piled on to all these previous speculations, which is, okay, this simple logic is nice, transitive inference, Bayes rule, but how about all the rest of logic? What do we do with quantifiers, Skolemization, and X, Y, Z, and all this stuff? I mean, that seems a whole added order of complexity. And I've thought in the back of my mind for about 2 years about how the brain could possibly ever do stuff like that in some way that's not a totally lame explanation, like saying, well, you know, that the brain is the operating system and there's some other program implemented on top of it. Is there any way to look at these higher order logic things as coming naturally out of what we know the brain to do? And the best idea I had so far goes back to the notion of higher order functions and combinatory logic. Because the notion that the brain maintains variables and lambdas and stuff just seemed out there to me. But if you look at the insides of a functional programming interpreter like Haskell, you can do stuff with no variables. And you have variable-free logic, Turing-complete systems with no variables. What you do, you have higher-order functions, combinators, functions that take functions as arguments, that take functions that take functions as arguments. And the math works out that you can do without variables by manipulating things in a tricky way. And if you're not familiar with this branch of math, I have no chance of conveying it in the next -1 minute. But what's interesting is that if you look at how neural networks could work, there's no obstacle to implementing that kind of higher order system. What you need is basically a neural net that looks at the internal connections as well as the input and output of a neural subnet. So it's actually acting on a whole neural net as its input, including the internals of it and the input and output. So if you look at a neural subnet that kind of serves as a router, and basically it acts like one or another neural net depending on the control signal, you can say, well, this neural net takes the internal state and input and output of this guy as its input. It gives some output. Based on the output, it's processed in some other way, flicks a switch inside, which then causes it to emulate another guy internally. And the logic of this is laid out in the paper. It's kind of complex, recursive thinking. But ultimately, by having a neural net act on another neural net as a whole and measure its whole state and give a response, you can implement arbitrarily complex higher order functions using neural nets that measure each other. You could represent anything in combinatory logic. You could get a Turing-complete system. You don't need variables. And the combination of that with the simpler probabilistic stuff I discussed earlier in the talk is, at very least, a tantalizing notion for how you might get this complex stuff out of what the brain does. To make an AGI system out of all this, there's a heck of a lot of intermediate steps, and I don't know what to do nearly as well as I do with Novamente. So I'm not really pursuing this actively, but I think it's an interesting area for investigation.